Welcome, everybody. Yes, am I audible? Everyone can hear me? Good evening. Yes, this sounds really good. I'm happy to see so many people on such an important topic, climate change, this evening. Before we get started, I have some bad news and some good news. Let me start with the bad news. Unfortunately, Jaime de Bourbon de Parme, the Climate Envoy in the Netherlands, isn't able to join us online this evening because he had a double booking in his agenda. That's a very unfortunate thing. As we speak, he is in Amsterdam, in the Bali, and he is discussing about the COP27, so about the same topic as he should have done here, but unfortunately he chose for Amsterdam. The good news is that Maarten van Aalst is in our midst this evening. Welcome, Maarten. Maarten is a full professor at the ITC, and he also visits the Sharm el-Sheikh climate conference. We will mention it COP27. And COP means, Maarten, that's abbreviation of the...
Conference of the Parties.
Conference of the Parties. Can we have the mic of Maarten? Yeah, Conference of the Parties 27. There are 92 heads of state, 30,000 delegates, so 30,000, please try to imagine that number, of 119 countries discussing the future of our climate. It's a very, very complex conference. Maarten will talk us through how does this work behind the scenes, how do people negotiate, what are the different levels of negotiations. You have badges. You brought your own badge, didn't you?
Oh,
Get your badge. Yes, we want to see it. That's very important because there are many different type of badges. Letting you in a certain session and letting you not in other sessions. So that's very interesting to know more about. And Maarten has a blue badge, I think. We'll come back to the badges later on. There he is. Yeah.
Right. So you don't enter the conference venue without one of these.
Yeah. But we will talk later. This blue color, what this means, and what you're into. First of all, Maarten van Aalst. He's a full professor at the ITC. He has a chair which is called Climate and Disaster Resilience. He's also director of the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. And that's new from February the 1st on. He is the chief director of the KNMI, that's the Dutch Meteorological Institute in De Beeld, near Utrecht. So that's congratulations, Maarten.
Thank you.
Luckily, you also stay at the University of Twente. That we're very happy about, but it's nice to mention that you're becoming this new director. Maarten, let's get started. Sharm el-Sheikh, you brought some beautiful slides with you. Many people have read, of course, about this conference in the news, but for myself, it was not really visible how it worked in detail, what's behind the scenes. And that's what Maarten is going to talk about this afternoon. You brought some beautiful slides with you. Perhaps we can have the first slide
give an impression. Who of you has been in Sharm el-Sheikh? Let me ask that first.
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah.
Anyone?
There.
You have?
Yeah. What does it look like, Maarten? You had a slide. Just to get an impression.
So this is of course, they put up these signs everywhere. It's basically in the desert, right? So the reason tourists go there is indeed the sea, the Red Sea, to be precise. And it's essentially, as soon as you go underwater, it's like finding Nemo, you know, these beautiful, amazing fish, these beautiful reefs, which actually are going to be gone unless this conference succeeds. It's an amazing, beautiful, tourist resort with this endless row of hotels, which went up about a factor 10 in price to welcome these tens of thousands of delegates for this particular conference. And as you can see, otherwise it's highways in the desert. And literally, I mean, this is not like it's a construction site or so. It's desert. This is what it looks like everywhere around it. So this is how you arrive from the airport. You drive to your hotel, and the next morning you come to the conference center, where there's indeed people from all around the world coming together in this huge venue to go and save the climate.
Yes, and there are 35,000 delegates from there are scientists, politicians, people from NGOs, How is this organized? How do we, and it started on the 6th of November till the 20th of November, the whole conference.
The formal schedule is about 2 weeks.
2 weeks,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Can you explain us how does it work? Because those people get there, they talk to each other. How is it organized? In the end, there should be a statement. We all read about it in newspapers. How is this whole process going from the start? What happens in the first week? Could you
Yeah, so
talk us
maybe
through?
I should take you back one step even before we get to the 27th conference of the parties. So in 1992, in Rio, the United Nations decided on 3 big environmental conventions. So the Convention on Biodiversity, which is meeting in Montreal these weeks, the Convention to Combat Desertification, and then this Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that was actually informed by science, because people were starting to get a little bit worried about what might be happening to our atmosphere. And they had asked scientists, can you take a quick look at what's known in the scientific literature about this potential problem? And that was serious enough to initiate this framework convention, but it was really a framework to be able to discuss this further. And that was in 1992. And since then, they have had the conferences of the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So this is the 27th time that all those countries that are united in this United Nations Framework Convention have met to put in practice what is needed in order to achieve the ultimate objectives of the convention, which is to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system, and then also to protect food security and alleviate poverty. So it's that big remit of the sustainable development of our Earth. And they have tried through those years to make it concrete what that means.
Yes,
So you may all be familiar with the 21st Conference of the Parties, COP21, COP21 in Paris in 2015, which was the second attempt, or actually in a way the third attempt. So after Kyoto 1998, Copenhagen 2009, Paris was the third attempt to put a stronger rule book in place, basically to fill in this framework with something that countries actually needed to comply with in order to save the climate. And in Paris, they finally succeeded with a somewhat lukewarm, but still quite ambitious Paris Agreement, as it's called. And the Paris Agreement has 3 overarching goals. The first was a temperature goal. So parties agreed the temperature should stay at least below 2 degrees, but ideally as close as possible to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial. Already quite scientific language, not something every person on the street will easily understand. We can unpack that if you like. But anyhow, a goal about limiting global warming, and that means reducing the emission of greenhouse gases. The second goal was accepting that the climate is already starting to change. So we need to adapt our societies, and richer countries have more means to do that. They are richer partly because they have already, in a way, contributed to the global warming. So there is an element of ensuring everyone can adapt. And that then leads to the third goal of the Paris Agreement, an agreement to transfer $100 billion a year, $100 billion a year from rich to poor. And that was actually a repeat of the, not formal United Nations agreement, but a sort of gentleman's agreement that was made in Copenhagen in 2009 to save the world not completely falling apart on climate at that point. So that 100 billion, the finance goal, was the third big goal of Paris.
Okay.
And then last year in Glasgow, as you may remember, COP26 was another one of these summit moments that all those parties to the convention came together again, this time in Glasgow, after a year's delay due to COVID, to take stock of where we were on those big Paris ambitions. And they said 2 things. First of all, we actually need to be a little bit more ambitious even than we were in Paris. So the below 2 degrees, but ideally below 1.5, it really needs to be 1.5. So they raised their level of ambition. And they also said, what we have now among us agreed to do to get there is not good enough. So we're going to step up, we're going to do more, we're going to transfer more finance, we're going to use more of it for adaptation, also to support those poorest countries to deal with what's already changing, and we're going to really reach the 1.5, which means we're going to reduce our emissions more quickly. And we'll come back next year in Sharm el-Sheikh with the concrete plans to do that.
Yes.
So that's what the level of expectation was coming out of Glasgow and preparing for this beautiful year after that great lofty political ambition to get ready for Sharm el-Sheikh. And then, of course, we all know what happened in February, and it's not been an easy year. And that's where we now arrived here in Sharm el-Sheikh at the implementation COP, as it was called, to go and achieve the Glasgow ambitions.
Yes. For you personally, you're not satisfied with the results, I suppose. But could you say something? What did you personally expect from this COP27, and how did it end up for you? I think the fund for the poor countries, that's okay. But please tell how do you view this? What happens to the implementation?
So basically, we needed progress on all those three goals.
Yes.
Well, let's start in a way with the easiest, if you could call it that way, the finance goal, because it's just 100 billion a year. You can just count it, and either it's there or it's not. And it should already have been there in 2020, and it still is not there right now. And of course, that's partly because of all these other crises. In the Netherlands as well, there's talk about inflation, and there's talk about needing to spend more on defense, and needing to welcome Ukrainian refugees here and pay for that reception, which is coming out of the same budget that would otherwise be transferred to poor countries, also to help them deal with their climate problems. Okay. So that one already not met. The second one was the temperature goal. And in a way, I think people were hopeful that something could be done, partly because the Ukraine war actually elevated prices of energy like crazy. So people are often quite optimistic that is finally the price signal that we need to get emissions down. But unfortunately, what we also see is that, gas is more expensive, so maybe we should keep those coal-fired power plants open for a little longer. In fact, maybe we should even build a couple of additional coal-fired power plants, because it's actually, it's a better energy mix, it's cheaper now. So it's actually even creating some lock-ins that will stay with us for 30 or 40 years if those power plants need to live through their lifetime to be economically efficient. We're building liquid natural gas terminals to, instead of having the gas coming from Russia, to be receiving it from our lovely Qatar, the host of our World Cup. So we're building liquid natural gas terminals that, again, will need to serve their economic lifetime. So what we've seen is still rising emissions. We should be going down. We're still rising. And in fact, we may be creating some lock-ins instead of doing a faster transition to renewable energy, which, in my view, would be the better solution to the current energy crisis.
Yes, of course. And what happened to the 1.5 degree ideal?
Yeah, so that's basically even more off track than last year. If you look at the science, it's very clear that global emissions need to peak in 2025 at the latest. So by 2025, the world, so not just the Netherlands or the European Union, but the world, including countries that are still growing very rapidly because they are still very poor, together, all of us, we need to be shrinking our total emissions. And that needs to happen basically 2 years from now. And we're not getting there. We have made progress since Paris, so let me be very clear. It's not like Paris didn't matter. It sent a signal to investors. It has resulted in the fact that there's now more investment in renewable energy than in fossil energy, for instance. So we're moving in the right direction, but just not fast enough to ever meet that 1.5 goal. We're overshooting. We're heading towards, business as usual, probably 2.8. If everything that's been promised now would be implemented, maybe 2.5 degrees of temperature rise. And one thing that also happened between Glasgow and Sharm el-Sheikh is 2 additional reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which made it very, very clear that the commitment last year to stick to 1.5 in Glasgow is actually even more important than we realized before. All of the risks that we're concerned about, ecosystems going under, global food security, water crises, all of these things, they're coming at us faster than we thought before. So at the same level of warming, we now estimate the risks to be more severe than what we thought before. So if anything, the science is telling us we need to speed up. But if we look at what's happening in practice, we're not seeing that speed.
We're not speeding up. Okay, I think we come back to this very important topic of speeding up, and perhaps we can talk about climate engineering. That's a technical way to cool down a planet. But first, we go back to Sharm el-Sheikh because we want to know how it works behind the scenes.
You were asking about how this whole negotiating process works. Well, the first thing that's important to realize, those 30 or 35,000 people that arrived here to the conference center, only a percentage of them, maybe 20-25% of them, actually actively participate in the negotiations. Most of those people don't even make it to the negotiation halls. But let's talk a bit about those people that do. So the segment, and I'll come back to what all those other people are doing there. But the segment that focuses on the negotiations. So what you have probably seen is these sorts of figures, right? A grand table high up on a big podium.
Oops, sorry, it was me.
In a big conference hall, and so imagine like the World Trade Center or the Jaarbeurs or those sorts of places. These giant centers, and then there's a high podium, and then every country has row after row from all the countries starting with an A to the countries with a B, etc., etc. With one big seat for a minister and a microphone, and then 2 civil servants behind them. And then, there's the COP president, in this case, the foreign minister of Egypt, the secretary on behalf of the secretariat of UNFCCC, some other officials, and they gavel through the formal decisions in the conference. So this is how the whole thing starts. So this is technically the conference of the parties. The first meeting where they all come together is like this. All the countries sit behind their benches, and the first thing they need to agree is the agenda. In this case, they spent over a day negotiating the agenda, partly because of the agenda item that in the end turned out to be really important, the item on loss and damage. Mm-hmm. So they agreed, at least in the first day, to talk about it after 8 hours of negotiations and with a big footnote caveat about what they were and were not going to be discussing. Mm-hmm. But then once they've done that, the agenda actually lists out all the issues that they need to be covering over those 2 weeks, but then it splits out in a number of so-called subsidiary bodies. So below this conference of the parties, there are a couple of existing processes that are mandated to take care of parts of that agenda. And within each subsidiary body, there are negotiating tracks for issues that subsidiary body is handling. So you split off first in a meeting that still looks a bit like this, so still the 192 countries with their country flags sitting behind a table with a high podium. But then they decide on how they're going to split it off in sub-items. And then those sub-items meet in yet another room. And by that time, you will have about 30 or 35 parallel negotiating tracks. One on forestry, again, one on loss and damage, as I mentioned. One on systematic observations, where there might be someone from KNMI, for instance, representing the Netherlands. Mm-hmm. One on finance. One on the global goal on adaptation, which still needs to be defined. How do we measure that? And so on and so forth. So you'll have about 30 to 35 tracks. Technical negotiating tracks, and I can show you a little bit.
And which track were you in?
I was primarily following, so there were actually 2 tracks on loss and damage. There was the Santiago network. Actually, there were 3, actually, technically even.
Okay.
So this is, in the acronym world of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, I'm in the in the UNFCCC WIM XCOM Tech CRM, which stands for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Warsaw International Mechanism Executive Committee Technical Expert Group on Comprehensive Risk Management.
My goodness! This is so relevant. I thought we did those things at the UT, those kind of everything, but this is...
So that group is mandated to inform the Warsaw International Mechanism that was established in Warsaw a couple of COPs ago, to lay the groundwork basically for this whole agenda item on loss and damage. And there were several. There was one on the fund for loss and damage, which in the end got agreed. There was also one on the so-called Santiago network, which was a mechanism for countries to exchange information on how this topic could be addressed. That was the compromise that they reached the year before, or the 2 years before Glasgow. So they're partly leftovers also of compromises that have been reached over time, but each of these need their separate negotiating track. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That would typically look a bit like this. So by this time, you see there's still, I don't know, is there a pointer here?
But this,
so what you...
How many people are sitting approximately around this?
So here, what you see here is there is a country badge here. So these will be negotiators representing countries. But you just pick your badge when you walk into the room. They're on a side table, and you sort of pick your country badge. And so this would probably be between 40 and 100 countries represented here. In many cases, by the way, it's good to know that the Netherlands, for instance, might not participate in all of those 35 tracks. Even though we have a sizable delegation, we would not have specialists on all of those tracks. The Netherlands negotiates as part of the team of the European Union. Mm-hmm. So every morning, there would be a separate side meeting of the European Union team, where the negotiators for those different tracks get their mandate from the collective member states plus European Commission to go and sit in this room, and then there might be someone sitting here, which could be the European Union delegate with the European Union badge, and or they could be Poland, and they could be negotiating for all of us, and everyone would know they'd be representing the bloc. And similarly, there is, and this is a very important one, the G77 in China, basically all of the developing countries together. Within that bloc, you've got the least developed countries, the LDC group. You've got the African group of negotiators. You've got the AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States. So all of those blocs have their own separate meetings, and then they have this big bloc meeting of the developing countries, which also, by the way, include China, include Saudi Arabia, include Singapore, interestingly. So, I mean, there's a couple of really rich countries with very divergent interests from the poorest developing countries. But they negotiate as a bloc as well. So you might still have quite a lot of countries here, but some of them might really be the negotiator for the whole G77 in China, but then there might also be someone from, say, Barbados, representing the subgroup of AOSIS within that. And the dynamics within and between those negotiating groups is an important element of this as well.
But Maarten, sorry to interrupt you. This looks really terrible to me. I don't like meetings, especially not big. This is suppose were you on one of the tables on this session?
I was.
Are you on the photo?
In some of these, I'm not in this photo. No. The sessions I participated in a formal sense, like sitting behind the table, would be sessions where the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, would have been asked by the chairs of a process like this to present their evidence from the latest assessment reports. So we are mandated as the Intergovernmental Panel to come up with the science, which then in a way becomes the Bible for these negotiators. They have agreed, we sign off on these IPCC reports as countries collectively, so that was a similar meeting earlier in the year to sign off on that report. But then once that report is agreed, that becomes our Bible. And then they invite the scientists that have written the Bible to come and read from the Bible. So that is the role I sometimes played here at the table.
Okay.
In my role as the International Red Cross representative, I would primarily be asked by some of these delegates on technical issues. So they would be interested in our opinion. What do you think about how we could solve this? Would this solution work for you? Do you think that would work in practice?
Yeah.
Or they would come and ask, have you heard anything from that other country bloc? Because, we are thinking in this direction. What do you think that would work? So everyone's also trying to get their intel of how the processes work.
Of course. But there is a chair, a man or woman of this session. Yeah. But all participants, they can't talk, I think, because then you're busy for hours. Or does this take hours?
This does take hours. Yes.
Goodness me! And then you have to raise your hand and you have to wait.
Yeah. The way you do it often is that this plaque is like it's a hardboard thing that it's like a triangle. It stands on the table. So you raise it up so it can stand on the side, and then it stands up, and then the chair, or actually the secretary sitting next to the chair, can see that you want to speak, and they have a list of everyone that wants to speak. Yeah,
but then you have to wait for at least 1 hour, I think.
Yeah, that takes a while.
Before it's your turn.
Yeah. So the main thing of these big meetings where everyone sits is also identifying the critical issues that they disagree about. And then the chair sometimes needs to find a solution to that, or they identify the need to have informals. And then you go from the informals, and you try and that's often still a large group of countries, and then you go from the informals to the informal informals. And then from the informal informals, you split off in a huddle. So a couple of us, why don't we go and we'll have a coffee and we'll try and find a solution. And you come back into the informal, and from the informal, there's a reporting back to the informal. That reports back to the contact group. And then gradually, through these dances, you try and find solutions with concrete text proposals. Yeah.
Goodness. There's a question. Go ahead. Simon, can we have the handheld, please? Yeah?
Yes. In which language is this all done? Is everything done in English or in multiple languages?
English is the main language. So what you see here, for instance, this is a contact group, and that would be entirely in English. The previous one that I showed you, so anything with the big podiums and so the this level, and also the immediate subsidiary bodies right under the COP would have continuous interpretation in all UN languages. So they would be fully interpreted. So the Chinese would speak in Chinese, the Russians would speak in Russian, the French would certainly speak in French. But outside of these main meetings, the language is English. Yeah.
Yeah. But let's make it personal. You went to Sharm el-Sheikh, you got out of the plane to your hotel, you entered this you also have a map of the whole thing. That's also interesting to look at. And then
actually,
you went.
Maybe first, there's another slide before we get to the map.
Yeah.
You were asking a bit. So, isn't that boring? How long does that take? Well, people do get tired, and it does get boring. And especially the last couple of nights, when you're partly also just waiting, we can come back to the dynamic, how it is handed over from technical negotiators to ministers. But at the end, I mean, this is not just some random diplomat. This is the climate ambassador for Germany, former CEO of Greenpeace International. I mean, these are not random people. I mean, you really get exhausted, and you really make very, very long hours sitting in these meetings. Yeah.
Incredible. Yeah, you don't have a picture of Jaime the Bourbon de Parme. I think that would have been...
If I would, I probably wouldn't have put it in this presentation.
Okay. Yes, I was asked a lot of things, but shall we first look at the map of the whole... How big is this whole conference in kilometer size? And make a comparison, please. And then I'll ask you about your ideals. You went in there, and what happened in all those sessions. Go ahead.
The entrance I showed you before is here. So you'd be dropped off with the bus here around the corner, and then you walk around, and then you enter here. So this is your first pavilion. This is where you get checked, and so there's a security check in the morning, so you go through like a bit like at Schiphol. And then here on the side, the first time you enter, you need to get your badge, which is the first thing. You need to have been registered by a country or an organization before. You need to get your badge. And here you need to enter the security area, and if you cannot, show this badge, then you don't get in at all. Then you enter a food court, and here is the first set of tents, huge tents. So this is this looks like, I mean, this is scale of the Jaarbeurs in Utrecht, for instance, right? Giant halls, on and on, hundreds of meters each of these tents in the desert, 30 degrees outside. So air conditioned that I would be wearing a suit, but the ladies that would have light summer dresses, because that's the most comfortable outside, would be bringing sweaters for inside because it was so cold. So you're in these air conditioned tents in the desert, and you can see they extend. So this is the first tent you arrive. Here's the Egypt pavilion. So these tents are basically filled with pavilions. So each of the countries has their own pavilion. Sometimes groups of countries have pavilion. The Netherlands is in the Benelux pavilion. But then there's also thematic pavilions. So you have a youth pavilion, there's a resilience pavilion, there's a locally led action pavilion, there's a social protection pavilion, there's a health pavilion, there's a food system pavilion, there is a business pavilion. So all of these pavilions have their own meeting spaces in each of these blue tents, and that itself is already a massive basically like a maze. And it wasn't very well signposted in Sharm el-Sheikh. So this is like, from here, when you enter, to say, here, for instance, are the European Climate Foundation offices, where I needed to give a press conference at some point. So I was here. I hadn't been there before. This is at least a 15-minute walk, but in a maze of all these little pavilions that are filling all these tents, and without a clear map of what's where. So this is already a big zoo, and all of this is just this pavilion space. This is actually where the main negotiating rooms are. So this is plenary 1, the one that I showed you with the big stage on top. This is plenary 2, another big one like that. And this is the original conference center, which has been extended with tents. But this is the negotiating area. And many people out of those 30,000 hardly make it to these rooms where the actual negotiations take place. Many of them spend most of their time in this first part, where you've got all those pavilions. And where many of those pavilions have their own programs from 9 o'clock in the morning to 8 o'clock in the evening, with every hour a panel where there's discussions on the topics partly negotiated here, but to some extent also just of interest to those in this space. So it becomes like a big jamboree also for everyone sort of circling around that climate negotiation rather than just that process that takes place in this conference center.
Mm-hmm. So this is about the size of our whole campus, our UT campus, or is it bigger?
That order of magnitude, I would say. Yeah,
okay.
It's like probably a 20-minute walk or so from one end to the other if you could just walk.
Yeah, about the same size. Okay. Yeah. You came from the Netherlands. When did you enter the conference?
On the Monday of the second week. So my colleagues, so we had a large delegation, and I had one colleague following the policy processes that I took over from her in the middle weekend.
Mm-hmm, yeah. Mm-hmm. Then you went to the entrance, you got your badge, you went in there, you had certain ideals, I want this, this, and this. But then you were into this whole negotiation circus. What ended up with your personal ideals in the end of the conference? Can you say something about this? What's your influence? How do you influence people so that in the end the result will be a little bit what you like of it? How does that?
Well, I mean, my big result would be that we get the climate crisis as a whole under control, right? Mm-hmm. So that is partly what I aspire to in general, and mm-hmm. but my expectations arriving at Sharm el-Sheikh to achieve that were low. It was not. Mm-hmm. It was clear that despite the ambitions of an implementation COP, maybe the best we could hope for was not sliding back. The part that was most directly my issue here, if you will, in Sharm el-Sheikh was this whole discussion on loss and damage. Mm-hmm. And that's because I was there for a humanitarian organization, but also having been doing the science in the IPCC about what impacts of climate change we are already seeing. And the question of that move from just dealing with the emissions to dealing with the impacts of climate change in a way that will prevent future potential problems, to a recognition that we have problems today already, mm-hmm. has been part of my own interest in this field. And we are working on the humanitarian consequences every single day. Mm-hmm. So figuring out solutions to support particularly the most vulnerable people that are being hit like that was my biggest interest coming to Sharm el-Sheikh. And of course that was a hot topic for discussion these 2 weeks, and actually maybe the one little bit where there was also some result.
Yes, yeah. I think it was thanks to you. I can't fully trace it in this negotiation circus, but I think you did a good job over there. Maarten, you told about the first 10 days, which were some kind of technical negotiations, and then the ministers came. That's where the politics happened. Why is it so separated?
The way it happens at the very beginning, heads of state mm-hmm. Arrive for a brief stint, like a day or so. You know, Mark Rutte was there as well, and they all give lofty speeches saying, you know, this is really important, we all need to do this. Then the technocrats go to work. So basically the professional negotiators, specialists, who are working on these 30 or 40 tracks to get texts ready for ministers, like you say. So the second week, ministers arrive from each country. So Rob Jetten, for instance, for us, leading their negotiations and sometimes also making the political calls to go beyond the original negotiating mandate. So the civil servants will have very strict instructions how far they can go, and they will try to reach compromise between the 192 countries to get the issues on the table in an as advanced form as possible for ministers to then consider the final make or break points that really need to be decided. So that first week in those 35 tracks, you try and create options, specific solutions. We want to make a decision on something like this. Well, I think it should be this way. I think it should be that way. Well, if we formulate it like this, could we compromise? No, we can't compromise. Well, then let's phrase 2 options and we'll give it to our ministers. But we want those 2 options to be clean. And we want to be sure if ministers decide it's going to be this option, that everyone can live with that as the political outcome, that it's technically sound. So the first 10 days is basically preparing texts as clean as possible with as few as possible options, but leaving the critical political issues as clear as possible on their table to then do the final week of horse trading to come to an agreement and in the end achieve an outcome of the conference with parties as a whole.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay. Are there any questions, by the way? Yes, I come with the mic. We're making a recording, not to scare you, but it's nice that we can hear your question. There you are.
Thank you very much. If I understand correctly, this year the Egyptians took a different approach, perhaps a more controversial approach, with sharing their draft text, their proposal for their text. Do you think that with COP moving to the Middle Eastern countries in one of the upcoming events, that could jeopardize the progress that you can make at a conference if they too decide to keep the discussions of the proposal draft text more internally as they did this year?
I think there's been a lot of speculation about the Egyptian presidency tactics, and I wasn't enough on the inside. I heard they were struggling partly with, just the capacity. It's a huge, huge job to do this well. One thing with the United Arab Emirates is they're already assembling a huge negotiating team. So I think, at least in terms of the technical capacity to run the process, they'll be strong, and they're hiring really good people. So, for instance, the former chief negotiator of the European Union is now on the United Arab Emirates presidency team. So they're recruiting heavyweights to do the technical side of the process well. The final stage, the presidency in a way shouldn't have a very strong agenda of their own. They should just be servicing the parties to make it work. Now, you're asking the question, I think rightly, what level of philosophy of the parties holding the presidency at that moment is part of that as well. But there's also an element of the negotiating tactics to make it work. So one strategy that the Egyptians deployed is to wait quite long with a number of technical processes still, and there were probably also a couple of countries keeping it technical for a very long time to basically stall the process. So middle of the second week, the Egyptians suddenly threw out a huge long text, way too long for ministers to be able to consider, like 40 pages of detailed outcome text. It was basically just a mess. And some people thought that was meant to then force ministers to say, well, okay, we're going to scratch this, we're only going to focus on these 5 issues. Thereby also getting the result that on certain issues you would not get progress, right? And that might also be what some countries were already hoping for. But it is a tactic for a presidency to play the game like that. Last year in Glasgow, at some point, there was a so-called biechtstoel process in Dutch. I don't know even what the English word is, but the confession box process is the literal translation. So you would, as presidency, not get all of the countries in one room and have them fight with each other and say, no, I disagree, no, I disagree with you, and no, if that, then I walk out, well, no, then I walk out. You let them come to you separately. And you're in a room as presidency with the minister of that country, and you ask, so what is your bottom line? Okay, so if you don't get your bottom line, you will walk out, because I'm going to talk to that other guy. And if his bottom line and your bottom line don't match, then I will go and give a press conference saying you two don't agree and you are both walking out. Is that what you would like to go into the press? It's not? Okay, so then where I mean, suppose I can get him to move. Where is your final red line? So, and then as presidency, you have that conversation with everyone, and then you do the math of all those different pieces, and you see, okay, so where could we move them closer together before you bring them together again? So that's another tactic that the English, for instance, employed quite a lot last year. Yep. And there's an element of just the process of diplomacy and which tactic you deploy as presidency, and always an underlying question of what does the presidency really aspire to themselves, You don't want to look bad as the president having failed the process, So a train wreck outcome is not what you want. How ambitious you want to be, really, yourself, difficult to gauge. And in that sense, I think on the United Arab Emirates, there's a couple of fronts where there is a strong indication that they want to make real progress. There are some doubts on some other files, also given their historical track record in the negotiations, for sure. Yeah.
Yep. Go ahead.
Hi. My question is more of a personal curiosity, but I imagine that when you go to such an event, you come in with your stance as an expert, as a person that's concerned with climate change, and a person that has his own personal values, but you also come in representing a third party. Was there any time where your own views and own values conflicted with those of the party you were representing? Or maybe also for the other delegates, how do you deal with that? So perhaps, you want to make changes, or you want to push for more extreme policy, extreme, not in actual extreme, but strong policies, but perhaps the country you're representing is not siding with such a strong policies. How do you deal with that? Have you dealt with it personally?
Thanks.
Yeah, so I have been in a relatively easy position there, I guess. So my two roles were representing the International Red Cross, which, well, maybe the part that would be an example of that is that until about 5 years ago, we only focused on the adaptation and finance elements, because the mitigation side, the emissions reductions, were considered, outside of our mandate, basically. Even though, based on the science at that time, I did have an opinion about that. But we would not, even if provoked by media, for instance, at COP, I would not say much about that. I would sidestep it, basically. That's different, of course, from saying something that you do not believe in, right? So it's more what do you prioritize within it. And there is a horses for courses. I also felt there was a lot to do in what we did want to do. The scientific perspective is actually a very easy one, particularly from the perspective of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, because you are taken so seriously, right? You have written the Bible. Now, of course, as a priest, I'm also not going to stray from the Bible, right? So I just tell what's in the Bible, and that's actually powerful enough. So I have not been confronted, certainly not in Marrakesh, with the tension that you describe. Maybe next year when if I would be on a delegation representing KNMI, I'd be part of the Dutch government delegation, and I'd have to stick with that line, then it might be different. Although I should say that overall, and that's maybe also something we can discuss and reflect on, I think both Robiette, but also Frans Timmermans as the lead negotiator for the European Union have really tried very hard. And I would personally be pretty proud of the Dutch perspective in the negotiations in Sharm el-Sheikh.
Did you meet Frans Timmermans in Sharm el-Sheikh when you were
we
there?
passed each other in passing. We didn't
and you
have
waved?
Yeah.
Hi Frans, hi Maarten. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Because of your question, it made me think of activism, climate activists. Were they in Sharm el-Sheikh? Were they allowed there to?
A few.
To
I think I actually have a few.
You had a picture of them, but
wait,
there were only a few. In Glasgow, there were how many?
So these are the side events. We can come back to that in a minute. But yeah, so there were a few, but it's like this, a handful defend 1.5, deliver climate finance, loss and damage.
Oh yeah.
But it's usually groups with, a group of placards, where in Glasgow we had marches with tens of thousands of people out in the street. Was anyone in Glasgow last year? It was difficult to get to with COVID at the time still, and also bloody expensive hotels.
But there were more activists than delegates in Glasgow.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
Here it's
here,
other way around.
so there were a few people. I mean, you can see that they have these courts as well, right? So they were registered by the UNFCCC, and then Egypt needed to let them in, and they were given a space in the conference center. But it's like little handfuls of people rather than the tens of thousands. There were certainly no tens of thousands marching the streets in Sharm el-Sheikh. It was bloody expensive to get there, but also security was heavy. And in general, civic space in Egypt was a matter that was being discussed also by civil society groups that were questioning whether this was the right location, also to put enough political pressure on the process.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what do you personally think of climate activism? People gluing themselves to Mona Lisas and things like that. Do you think it's a good thing, or do you think, well, that's not the right way to do it? I'm curious how you, as a diplomat, negotiator, think about this activism.
Well, I think I fully understand the anger, and I think that anger also needs to be heard as part of the spectrum of voices, where you also have people pushing very hard in the other direction. So I think it's very valuable. I personally, as a scientist in the role, as a priest for the scientific Bible, if you will, in the negotiations, wouldn't take that role, because I think it would take my own credibility away just representing those facts. So I usually choose deliberately a quite sort of, well, some would say bland way of representing that science. And I do think that is important in this process as well. But at the same time, don't underestimate the power of these voices. And I think also senior negotiators, including the likes of Frans Timmermans, both being inspired by especially younger generations, providing these voices, but also recognizing that they're going to be held to account in their own societies, having to answer to these same voices. So it does have political significance. And just like we know that, I mean, there were hundreds of representatives of the fossil fuel industry there as well, for instance, and those voices are heard, well, then we bloody well
Sure.
make sure that these voices are heard as well.
Yeah. I have an interesting quote from Paul van Tongeren. He is the national thinker, the Denker des Vaderlands, about climate activism. And he says, I sympathize with them. This works much better in the media than what the thousands bobos at COP27 are doing. So he is very clear that the people gluing it, or there was that guy in a talk show who glued himself to a table. That was national news, or maybe international news. That really highlights the problem. So it's important. Are there any climate activists in the... Yes, there is one. Sorry, I want to know what you're doing, because we think this... And it's at the UT, there's also climate activism, because there was a group of Newton guys going to Shell, and they were blocked by Extinction Rebellion. So
not only Extinction Rebellion, also Scientist Rebellion and University Rebellion, which is like a spin-off at the UT and other Dutch universities from Extinction Rebellion. And so I was also participating in postponing the study trip of this Newton Association.
Exactly, yeah.
Part of the reason is that we feel strongly about certain ties that the UT has. Maybe you can also comment on the role that UT has, like in the big picture of these climate negotiations. And so we looked a bit into ties we have, and there was like also a statement released from UT on behalf of the executive board, commenting on this action and applauding Shell as an important role in this energy transition, which to my mind just put out counterfactual information. It claimed that all the research that we have at UT with companies like Shell would only be beneficial towards the energy transformation. Well, when you look at the UT own homepage with showcase company collaborations, there's one case of Shell where we develop robots for gas and oil pipelines and the maintenance work to delegate it to robots. I don't know how this is beneficial to energy transition. Even worse, there is BP on the showcase page of the UT, where we do research on how we can extract more fossil fuels from already existing reserves. And UT is doing research on this, and I don't see how this is beneficial for the energy transformation.
Okay.
And this is why we do action at the UT.
Yes, you made that perfectly clear. Maarten, how do you think? You're an established professor at this institute. Do you talk to the executive board about these things? Do you spreek je hen daarop aan? Do you, how do you say that in English? Bring this to the table at the executive board, the BP, Shell connections?
So I haven't discussed this particular topic with the executive board, but the general question of how do we position the UT on climate and what choices does that also entail is rightly a topic of very active discussion. You're asking the question, what does that mean in relation to the negotiations? I think that's maybe one question, but the UT isn't really represented in these negotiations other than through individuals in their own organizations or their own networks. But I also feel that actually, it's not so much about how the UT is represented in these negotiations, it's how the UT contributes to whatever the negotiations show needs to be done in the world. And that is where these decisions really matter, and these debates really matter. Because we're not going to make the shifts that are aspirational here, but not accompanied with implementation instruments, unless everyone around the world has these discussions and forces the sort of changes through that are going to be essential for that big transition in society to take place, much more quickly than we're doing right now. So that would be something I would also be raising with the university board and, in all places where I think everyone has a responsibility.
Yeah, okay, that's very clear. Let's go back to Sharm el-Sheikh, because you had your badge. You're a green observer
green bluish
status.
Yeah.
Could you say something about the badge system? How does it work, and what this gives you access to what type of negotiations?
So this is a badge that you would get. So this blue green
observer. It says.
Observer is so the UN agencies, like inside the United Nations system, have full blue badges. They, particularly if they're UNFCCC, they have sort of behind the scenes access to do the the administrative support to the organization, but they're not supposed to have an opinion of their own, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then you have the international observer organizations that would also include, for instance, development banks, right? The World Bank, for instance. They are not part of the United Nations system, but they have some sort of an intergovernmental legal basis. In the case of the International Red Cross, the Geneva Conventions. So we also have a permanent observer status, for instance, in the UN Security Council, because we have a responsibility for international humanitarian law. The next, tier, if you will, the highest tier, so the top badge that gets you the biggest access power in a way, are the so-called pink badges. I don't know why they've ever been made pink, but everyone knows them as the pink badges, which are the country badges. So if Jaime de Bourbon, for instance, if you have a pink stripe here with Netherlands, then that means you're a country. So it's you are a party in the Conference of the Parties, and you have a right to a seat at the table and a voice and a vote. So as an observer, there would be closed meetings only among parties, certainly in the last couple of days, that observers would not be allowed to. Now, there would be some meetings that I would be allowed to, but there are also yellow badges. Those are observers from civil society. So, for instance, a World Wildlife Fund or a university, if it was registered, would have, in a way, a lower status badge in terms of access to some meetings than, say, the IPCC or the World Bank or the International Red Cross, because we have a sort of intergovernmental connotation, which means that governments have at some point decided that they want us, and they want us in certain roles. And then there is press, which, of course, also, they don't have a seat at the table, they don't have a voice in the negotiation, but they are an important megaphone for the different voices. So they circle around these meeting rooms, sometimes with cameras, sometimes just written press. They don't have access into the meeting rooms when the meetings are closed, just like I would not, and certainly the NGOs also would not, but the press also doesn't. They do have their own media center, so they can invite you into the media center for interviews or for the press conferences they do, but that's their space. And access to that space is also coveted, because journalists are both, of course, your megaphone to the world. They also have very interesting networks across different negotiating groups. So it's often also this game of giving them some of the intel that you have, but also gaining a little bit of the insight of how they look at the process at that point.
So you had good friends at the press, and you drank coffee with them or ate a sandwich, just to hear things?
You catch up and you give them, you give them some of the insights of the issues we discuss. And so that's partly also where, if you know the science that matters here, and you can interpret what's happening in the negotiations from a perspective of what the science is bringing to the table, or if you're a humanitarian voice, if one of the issues is loss and damage, and we are at that point responding to a disaster that has happened, the Nigeria flooding, for instance, that was ongoing during the COP, that is an interesting tidbit in their stories, their reporting about the COP.
Yes, yeah.
So you need, for the media, I mean, they're also professionals. They're doing their job, writing stories for the newspaper or making items for the 8 o'clock news or whatever. And so you need to give them something that they can use in their work too.
Yes, of course. Yeah, you need to understand their language too.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there any questions? Yeah. Let's go to you. There you are.
So we heard a lot about how extensive COP is, and it's like 35,000 people flying to Egypt, probably producing a lot of CO2 on the way. We heard about the air conditioning, we heard about all of the processes going on, and not a whole lot coming out of it. So with your own experiences from COP as a scientist, how can we change this event? How can we make it more effective and maybe at least a little bit more efficient with what we're putting in?
Yeah, and more sustainable, perhaps. Yeah, that's a really sharp question. Maarten, you can think about, do you want a glass of water? You have, we have some water. I'll give you some more. Then you can think.
So I personally feel it has gotten a bit too big. The problem is, how do you cut it down, right? So who are you not going to give access? And it's actually quite a special process in the sense that so many organizations, especially also civil society organizations, do have access. It's an opener UN process than on average, and that is a very important part of the character. So I would not want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, saying let's cut down the numbers if the first numbers that would be cut would be the NGOs, for instance. Then I'd rather just accept that we have to live with the mess and we have to do better signposting so we can at least find our way. Compared to the scale of the problem, this ridiculous tent space in the desert or those people flying in for those 2 weeks, of course every little bit matters, so I'm not saying it's completely irrelevant, but it's minor compared to the total scale of the problem. And it is the only forum that we do have where these issues are being discussed. And even if we fail, it's clear for the world. It's in the world's eye that we're failing. The solutions, in my view, are never going to come only from the lowest common denominator of 200 countries or so negotiating in the United Nations. So it is the only place where we can put pressure on everyone to raise the lowest common denominator, and that's critical for the world. But the energy also needs to come from lots of places that are going to move a lot faster. So partly I would say to those 40,000 people, really think about whether you really add value to this process. And on average, I'd say we need to spend more energy on all these other places where we can really move the needle. But that's a discussion everyone needs to have within their own organization. And I mean, I personally felt our own delegation was on the large size. You know, we had 40 people in total, and I think it's a lot. The argument we had for our delegation was partly that we were bringing many people from the developing countries, so the national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies from some of those poorest countries, who were also dealing with their government there and organizing the accountability. So one thing I mentioned to you, I mean, you were asking about the badges. Mm-hmm. For instance, my Uganda Red Cross delegate was actually not on an IFRC badge, but he was part of the Uganda country delegation. So he was accompanying his government into some of those negotiations. Partly got us good intel from some of those meetings, but partly also had access in places that others wouldn't, and was also building alliances there in ways that others that he might not have been able to had he just visited that ministry in Kampala. Mm-hmm. So sometimes it's also difficult to judge what other things are happening among those 40,000 people, also in all those side events I mentioned, that may not directly contribute to the greatest outcome in terms of the final negotiating text that comes out of this process, but that does have a meaningful other impact elsewhere in the world, in that higher ambition than we just get from the overall process.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. I saw many questions. I come to you, but we have an interesting question from the Instagram channel, so people can in advance send in questions about this topic. And that was a really intriguing question. What can we, as an individual, do to induce change on political or institutional level? So we're just individuals, and we feel it's a very, very big world-scale problem. What can we as an individual do to influence? Of course, we can vote on a Green Party, for instance, but...
Yeah, and don't underestimate it, and especially younger generations. I mean, if you look at the global statistics, mm-hmm. It is on average an older generation that is voting much more frequently, and often out of line, I would say, with what the science says is best, at least across all the generations. Mm-hmm. So I think there is a difference in perspective, even in terms of just the economics of of what your world looks like, how long you're going to have to live with this problem. If you look at it very cynically, even from that perspective, just young people at least using their vote, which they currently aren't, to the same level that all the generations do, is a starting point. That would, if all young people in the world would vote, we would not have had Brexit, for instance. So I think that's an important starting point. Let's not forget about the small things that matter. I personally also strongly believe it is a mixture of top-down and bottom-up. Mm-hmm. And the ability of an individual to influence the outcome of Sharm el-Sheikh is limited. Mm-hmm. The ability of an individual to influence the outcome of Dutch elections is not negligible. I don't think we should be cynical about that. And the Netherlands' voice does matter within the European Union. The European voice certainly matters in this process. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you a bit more about how that matters. But that really matters. Mm-hmm. So our influence is, in that sense, tangible. That's still the Dutch voice in this lowest common denominator. So to a larger extent, I think your individual impact is going to come from what you do from the bottom up. Indeed, having these discussions at the UT, or making your own decisions in your own household, or talking to your own friends, or talking to your own grandparents about how they vote. All of those issues help. And we need everyone to be active like that on all those different fronts.
Yeah, yeah. Erik, you had a question, then I come to you. I don't forget you. That's don't worry. But you, maybe you're a politician as well. So go ahead.
Yeah. So I think the question was very interesting, but it's also so the question was, what can you do on an individual level in politics? And I think somehow that contradicts, because the essence of becoming politically active is to organize yourself into a group. So as a student here, that's why I joined Sustain, afterwards joined Scientists for Future, then joined a political party. And there are multiple green parties here in the room. So there is Partij voor de Dieren, there's GroenLinks, and then me.
And from which party are you representing? Just not
Volt.
Volt.
But the amount of active members within a political party everywhere is very low. And that's the thing I want to emphasize. If you want to have an impact, and if you ask the question, what can you do as an individual? I also want to say, not much, if you stay an individual. So yes, voting is one thing, and maybe having a discussion is another thing, but become part of something big. Maarten is from the IPCC, and that means that the impact is not just your personal impact, but it's of an institution, of a bigger group, wherein you can specialize and use that mass of the group. So yeah, I think that aspect was maybe missed, that become part of a group, a collective.
Yeah. Okay, it's a very nice addition. Thumbs up. You had a question. Here you are.
Yes, I did. So my question would be that if the purpose of this whole conference is to reduce, to make the world a better place and more sustainable, then why are certain oil companies, for example, invited, whose main purpose is basically serving their shareholders depending on the structure of their company?
Okay. Maarten, who decides on inviting who? How does that work, this whole inviting circus?
The way it works is that you get, so there are two ways for an individual or a company or a university or so to get into this space. One is to become part of a country delegation. So if Shell would be invited by the Dutch government to join their delegation, that would be an option. But the same is true for the UT. Or you can try and register on your own. Then you need to have legitimate interest. So if you're an environmental NGO, for instance, you can register and in principle you'd be accepted. For industry, there's also industry groups. And if you're a legitimate industry group with an interest in the process, you would also, in principle, be admitted. And I think there is also something to be said for all the voices to be heard in this process. I think it would be difficult to decide for a secretariat of a process like this who should be allowed to have a voice and who should not. So I think there's an underlying assumption that you feel that those types of voices should be banned from a process like this, which I would question. I wonder how you can do it. I think we need to have the debate between all the different voices, and we need to recognize all the different interests, and then challenge our politicians to come up with an outcome that does justice to the science, and that responds to the demands from, in the end, their electorate to do the right thing for current and future generations. Whether that scrutiny of all the political decisions is currently working optimally is another question you could ask. But I'm not sure that banning voices like, the oil industry, for instance, from the process would be the solution to that problem.
Okay, that's a clear answer. I saw questions over here. You have a very nice T-shirt from Chaos. The most beautiful things come into existence.
Yeah,
that's promising. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. My name is Ico. I'm from Extinction Rebellion. I have the question for you. Do you have an advice for Extinction Rebellion, a strategic advice? Do you dare to say something about that? How to get that to next year? What would be the most influence?
Yeah.
Have you thought about it?
Intriguing question. Maarten, your advice to Extinction Rebellion. Shall I get you some more water? You can think. They're very intriguing questions.
Yeah, no, it's
So-
a very, very good question. I mean,
Yes.
to be honest, I do need to think about that for longer, partly because it is not my expertise. You know, I really feel that the sort of campaigning that Extinction Rebellion, but also many other organizations that showed up here at COP, the youth movement in general are doing, that's a skill, you know, and I don't think lightly about it. I don't think I could do the strategizing for that and provide you with good advice.
You might help.
Well, what I can say is I think we need two elements. We need to keep the issue on the agenda in the face of lots of other competing problems. So that's clearly one challenge of this day and age. I mean, after Paris, climate rose on the agenda for a couple of years. It was clear also in industry things were moving. But then with COVID, basically attention waned. So Glasgow felt less urgent in a way after COVID.
Yeah.
And now we've got
energy
Ukraine,
crisis,
geopolitical challenges, energy, food crisis. So again, there's a risk that we lose sight. There's a beautiful cartoon in The Economist at some point of these different waves coming on top of one another, and the biggest wave not being recognized. I think that is one thing to make sure that we stay focused on that big issue. A second one, and that is harder, where again I'm not sure I have good strategic advice for you, but I think the biggest challenge at this point is so the attention. I think to some extent you are already you are getting that attention, and I think that's an important function also of organizations like Extinction Rebellion. The more challenging part is also to have the conversation, for instance, on all the science that's in that Bible, with those that are not yet converted. And that to me is the harder part, right? How do we reach, a good example maybe from the United States, where we were advising the American Red Cross for a long time. And in the United States, you've got all the different charities, and the United States is a very charity-oriented country, right? Churches, but also charities play a big role, partly fulfilling roles that would be taken by government here. The Red Cross is part of that network, but also in a very inclusive way across all segments of society. So there would be a number of international humanitarian NGOs that would be perceived as very left-wing, would only be supported by voters leaning Democrat, for instance. That's not the case for the American Red Cross. They are a neutral organization, like the Red Cross should be in general, but also they really get their supporters, their volunteers also doing humanitarian work in their own communities from the whole spectrum of society. Now, if I would have barged in with a perspective on climate change that would have immediately put not just me, but also the entire American Red Cross in the camp of climate activists, Democrats, Biden, Satan, whatever, however people would classify it, I would have lost the opportunity of having the dialogues also in those places. So finding a subtle way of having the dialogue also with the people that are struggling with many other things, that maybe have other belief systems, but that are attracted in this case to that basic humanitarian mandate of the Red Cross to want to prevent suffering. And bringing it with a different tone, with a different style, also to those communities in the Midwest, for instance, is, I think for me, an almost more existential challenge for whether we're going to bring the world together to really solve this really big problem. Than just putting it higher on the agenda of many people that are already to some extent converted. Maybe not converted enough. I'm not saying that all the work is done also for, say, the Rob Jettens of this world. I think we need to ensure that the ambition stays high everywhere. But I think it's harder in the parts where I'm quite sure many of our current communications, I'm afraid that includes Extinction Rebellion, but I'm afraid it also includes much of our science, doesn't reach at the moment. And I'm not sure if I have strategic advice. If I had it, I would use it. But I'd be keen to hear people's advice or to continue after the discussion. I think that's the big question.
I think you got some food for thought about you're welcome, about the Extinction Rebellion strategy. There are many questions. Shall I start with you? Yeah, you were first. Go ahead.
one of the main themes why you went to Sharm el-Sheikh was loss and damage. Those words are clear for you. I guess they are related to the Red Cross, but can you clarify it a little bit more? Which loss, which damage?
So if there was a universally agreed definition, the last night at Sharm el-Sheikh might have been a bit shorter. So I'm afraid there is not one simple answer, but I'll try and give it a start. So the first hurdle, also that in the negotiation sense needed to be crossed, is that we are now in an era of climate impacts. So climate change was thought of as this long-term environmental problem. We needed to figure out how big it could become to then reduce greenhouse gas emissions so that it would not become a problem. To the extent we had not reduced those emissions and the climate was already changing, there were going to be some changes, and we would adapt. So that was the second branch. We would adapt so that we would prevent those changes in the climate system from resulting in impacts on ecosystems or human societies. Now, we are now in a new era where we know we haven't done enough on either front. And in fact, you will never do enough on the second front if you don't do the first. So we are now seeing climate impacts materializing in front of our eyes. And the science has also progressed to the extent that we're not just seeing that in an abstract sense over 30-year averages. You know, climate is traditionally defined as the average weather conditions over 30 years. But the way we're doing the science right now is we can pinpoint it in individual events. So if a really bad flood like the one in Germany last year occurs, or a really strong heat wave like the one in Canada, or the floods in Nigeria during the COP, we can look at that individual event and then do the statistics to see how climate has changed either the intensity or the frequency of that particular weather event that caused that particular disaster. So you get a fingerprint of climate change on an individual impact, also an individual damage, if it's cost that can be, you know, recovered in a way, or loss in case of something lost forever. That has changed the dynamic of those negotiations. So that science has had an immediate impact. Typically then it's damage if it is replaceable. So for instance, if your house has been destroyed and you rebuild it, then you get compensated for the damage, you rebuild your house and you're back to square one. Loss would be something like, well, for instance, if we cross 1.5 degrees, those beautiful coral reefs in Sharm el-Sheikh would be gone, and they're not recoverable. It's lost. So those two terms are meant by it. And in a negotiating sense, the question is who pays for those losses and damages, and how do those who have contributed less to the greenhouse gases, who have not received enough support to adapt, how do they get compensated for what is now coming their way by the rich countries that have caused the problem?
Yep. Thanks. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Am I audible? Yeah.
Yes, it's working.
So, as you said, there are only 20% of the people who actually take part in the negotiation, and the rest 80%, they don't take active parts into it. So, what I've observed in recent times is that companies have started a thing called submitting a letter of motivation. So if you have the motivation which is in alignment of the company and their goals that they want to achieve, then you're selected. And if you just have small motivations like just to earn money through the job, it's not a qualifying term. Can such thing be applied to such an event so that every country or every organization have to submit a letter of motivation of how they are going to contribute to this event, or what do they think, like what topics they are going to highlight during this event? Can this help to reduce the 80% of crowd that is not contributing actively? Do you think such thing can help?
Interesting suggestion. Maarten, is it realizable?
I mean, all these types of, I mean, maybe not this one so precisely, but these sorts of questions, like how can we decide, like, so first of all, country delegates there will not be a selection. So this would apply to the not to the pink badges, but to all the others, possibly. As I said, I think there is a risk there that you will start losing certain voices. And my main question back to you would be, who would decide Would it be the UNFCCC Secretariat or the presidency of this year? Would it be Egypt this year that decides who gets to come or not, based on the motivation letters? So that is the real struggle that the UN would have. You need a country government process. The countries have said civil society, for instance, needs access. Now, who are the countries going to mandate to screen who in civil society does or doesn't get access? And how do you avoid that from becoming political, with some voices being considered better motivated than others? Well, on what criteria? Which motivation is better than the other?
So you said that you were in the committee who has written the Bible for COP. So maybe you can be on the board of deciding what aligns to the Bible or what doesn't. Let's say if there are views that are completely opposite to what's written in the Bible, but the motivation should be so strong that, yeah, okay, we want to hear this, and this like we haven't thought of like this kind of opinion does exist in the world, so let's give them a chance. But let's say opposing party which doesn't agree to the Bible, but it's like a very small kind of very meager motivation, so it's not very important point of that you want to include, so that can be done. I don't know how that is done on a very big scale, like 35,000 people.
Yeah, so I'm not sure you'd find many scientists willing to volunteer for this job, I'm afraid. I do like the suggestion. So, I mean, I'm having discussions with colleagues in the UNFCCC Secretariat that are struggling with these questions in real life right now. But I promise you, people are trying, but it's not easy to find particularly the political solution. And one of the reasons scientists wouldn't like it is that it's just going to be a hell of a lot of work, and you're always going to be blamed, whatever you decide. But also that as scientists, you wouldn't want to take sides, right? And the same is true for the UNFCCC Secretariat. You know, how do you go about that accusation that you have decided that one voice is better, more aligned with the Bible than another? I mean, do you want to be in that position if you want to be trusted as the neutral voice of science in this case?
Maybe the HRs can tell best about
sorry?
Maybe the HRs can tell how to deal with such kind of situations because they are used to it.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for this interesting suggestion and discussion. We go on.
Thank you. First, I wanted to say in your answer to Extinction Rebellion, I think I heard echoes of Catherine Hayhoe's book, Saving Us. Yeah, that's okay. But that was not what my question was about. It's very interesting for Extinction Rebellion to read, I think. My question was, we've heard about the opinion of activists about cutting ties with Shell at the same time. They are here. You're into climate damage and reparations. We know Shell has fought tooth and nail to avoid paying for damages they did in Nigeria to the environment, and I think that they will do so in the same way in the future. Do you think companies like this that have been and still are a huge part of the problem can be part of the solution, or is it hopeless and are you in the Shell must fall camp, basically?
No. I mean, first of all, I don't think either as a scientist or as a Red Cross representative I'm in a position to say anyone must fall, you know. And I am hopeful, and I do see that shifts are happening much faster also on this front than 10 years ago. At the same time, I'm not naive, and I see that there are huge vested interests that we need to recognize, and that in the end, I think politicians need to come to grips with, and voters need to hold politicians to account for, to ensure the common interest in the end is served. You can't expect Shell with their shareholder interests as the organizing principle, given the way they are constituted, to suddenly, you know, just do what's right for humanity. That's just not how they are set up. You know, just like I, in the Red Cross, am not representing the shareholder values of Shell, even though shareholders of Shell might like that very much, but I don't. So there's a horses for courses in terms of the roles different actors play. The incentive structures have already resulted in the Gulf states, for instance, starting to invest in renewable energy, in many fossil fuel companies starting to invest in renewable energy. To me, it is a question of how do you change the incentive structure to make those sorts of changes happen, and if they then contribute to that overall transition, you know, everyone that contributes will be welcome. At some point, if we need to stop exploring fossil fuels in order to stick to the scientifically clear paths that we need to be on to stick to the Paris Agreement, then if the only way of survival of those companies is to continue something that is clearly at odds with science, then we have a problem, right? But in the end, that's for politicians to sort out with those companies. And for us to hold politicians account to find the solutions to do that, which is not going to be easy. And at some point, possibly also courts. I think that's also what you start to see playing out right now, right? So, yeah, I don't have an easy solution or a very strong opinion of my own. But certainly, maybe that's the final comment I'll give on this. I do think the legal dimension, like we've seen with the nitrogen discussions in the Netherlands, is one that is starting to become a reality also. And you start to see not just companies proactively reacting to that risk, but you also start to see investors getting nervous about that. And I think that might be a very powerful force in the coming years as well. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Go ahead.
I have a question somewhat related to that question, actually, but also to what you mentioned earlier about the war in Ukraine and how that has, incentivized to build more coal power plants, et cetera, et cetera. That is, of course, not the direction that we want to head into, but since you've been at this conference where the people are that make the decisions, do you feel that, in a way, it has also triggered them to think about, hey, we should be less dependent on a few countries that produce all of the fossil fuel that we need for our current society? So I guess in a sense the question is, are you more of a climate optimist or a pessimist? Do you think that in the end it will actually help us to transition faster?
Yeah. Are you an optimist or pessimist? I think he's an optimist, but let him... you give the answer.
I am an optimist. But I do think this discussion needs to be had, and it needs to be had out in the open more than it is currently. Because we are used to a crisis mode right now, and we're accepting a crisis mode, and we're accepting short-term we're accepting short-term solutions to short-term, seemingly more urgent problems, while forgetting for a while about climate. And I think we cannot afford to forget about the long-term climate lock-ins that we may be then sort of locking ourselves into at the same time. With the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change, for instance, we're providing, so we are mandated to provide advice to the European Commission and also the European Council on a number of topics like the emissions targets for the European Union. But we can also give unprovoked pieces of advice when we feel that that's warranted given the policy landscape of the EU. This is one topic that we've decided to issue an advisory about because we do think the science is pretty clear on what can be done in light of the short-term crisis that we have that still aligns with the expressed policy goals of the European Union in order to achieve the Paris Agreement targets or the fair share of the European Union to the Paris targets. And that science needs to be on the table and needs to be considered when those short-term decisions are being made. So maybe that's the practical way in which I'm trying to contribute to that discussion, at least in Europe. Yeah.
We were going to do a couple of last questions. I had one myself, actually. We are organizing this together with the KIVI students, the engineers at this university. And engineers tend to solve problems. So in Sharm el-Sheikh, there's a lot of talking, and the climate is warming up. Climate engineering or geoengineering, what do you think of it? So there are scientists at the TU Delft, they are inventing some kind of solar shields to shield off the sun, or they're leaving aerosols high up in the atmosphere to block the sunlight. Do you think we're going to need that? And is it a wise thing to use? What do you think about this?
Okay, let me take one little step back just to get the terminology right. So geoengineering that word has been around for about 15, 20 years, and basically has two big branches. So the one is what's called carbon dioxide removal, trying to get the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere down in order to reduce the overall global warming. Almost all of the IPCC scenarios that keep us below 1.5 degrees have some of this carbon dioxide removal. The easiest, I wouldn't call it necessarily super easy, and it's certainly also not yet super cheap. It's also not quite clear on what scale we can do it. but would be to grow biofuels. So you grow plants, you burn them up, say, to produce electricity, and then you capture the CO2 at the power plant, and you store it underground. That way you have a net removal of CO2 from the atmosphere while producing energy. Now, there are technical issues. There are questions about scale at which this can be done, but it's a feasible technology that can be invested in. And again, that there are very few scenarios that don't rely on that at all. So it's arguable how easy it's going to be. And in the Netherlands, for instance, the first experiments with this were blocked because I think it was Barendrecht, where we would do this first underground storage of CO2. Local population disagreed. They didn't want that storage to happen underground in their area. So there are also questions about acceptability. But it is moving, and I think it is, in terms of the risks associated, it's clear what sort of risks we're talking about. Which, by the way, if you rely on it on a very big scale, would also be the competition of the production of biofuels with production for food security. So there are big trade-offs to be considered. So don't rely on this as your golden bullet out, I would say. But it's an understood set of risks that we're dealing with. The second branch of geoengineering is maybe what you're referring to more. It's what's called solar radiation modification. You're referring to tiny mirrors in space to block off a little bit of sunlight. That is indeed an option, but you need quite a lot of mirrors. That's a super expensive solution. The scary thing about one of these solutions is that it's so cheap. So this is when I got seriously, well, first worried, but for some people this will be maybe a reason for optimism. The mimicking of volcanic eruptions is cheaper per degree warming avoided than the shift to renewable energy. So you may recall Mount Pinatubo in the early 1990s. You can see the global temperature, which was gradually going up, with little bumps, but going up to global. You can see a little dip right after Pinatubo. You actually even see it in global sea levels, which were gradually going up, but then you see a little dip in that year after Pinatubo. So if you dump, in this case, sulfur high enough in the stratosphere, so above the layer where we've got our clouds and rain, and so it stays there for about a year or two. So if you do that with rockets or with airplanes, high-altitude aircraft, and you just keep dumping it, then you can create that continuous layer that shields sunlight like that. And that turns out to be cheaper than the energy transition that we need. So to some, this is a very attractive solution, and particularly if it's indeed so cheap. The problem is, and this is where this second level of risk comes in, it is not just turning back the clock like carbon dioxide removal is. So if you remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, there are, it takes time for the system to go back to normal. There's also carbon stored in the ocean. There are all kinds of challenges why this is not just simple, but in principle, the atmosphere system will respond by turning back to its old stage gradually. If you are adding another disturbance to the system, in this case the sulfur in the stratosphere, you're giving the system another whack, right? So you might be shifting rainfall systems, which might not sound so bad, if a whole rainfall system, it's more or less the same amount of rainfall, it just shifts a bit. Well, it means some people that were used to monsoon rainfall are suddenly not getting it anymore, so they have an agriculture system relying on the rain, and suddenly it's gone. And other people that didn't have rain before are suddenly getting a lot of rainfall. So they didn't have protective infrastructure, and they're suddenly being hit with floods. So those sorts of effects, and you'll never be able to tell whether it's due to that intervention or it's just that side effect of that climate change, which is going wackier and wackier as it's getting hotter. Yeah. So the risks associated with that would be huge and are poorly understood. And there are additional risks because once you start doing it and you keep building up greenhouse gases, you can't turn it off because then you get all the warming that you've built up in the meantime. So you're sort of addicted to those additional, that solution which comes with the additional risks. The one reason why you would want it, and actually my own PhD supervisor 20 years ago was the first to say we probably do need to study this at least.
It was Paul Crutzen, by
Paul
the way.
Crutzen, he said we may need that safety valve, particularly if we get into runaway climate change scenarios. So there are a couple of positive feedback systems in the climate system where if you cross certain thresholds, so One example is if all the ice in Greenland melts, then you create a surface that absorbs more sunlight, so it gets warmer, and the ice also doesn't grow back anymore, and the whole Arctic gets even hotter. Methane deposits freeing up when permafrost melts or ocean deposits get disturbed.
Yep.
If that methane is released, it's a very powerful greenhouse gas. You get more warming, therefore you get more methane released, therefore you get more warming. So in those sorts of cases, when suddenly the whole thing would explode, you get this drastic, very quick warming, you may want the safety valve of doing something like this. But I would say we should reserve it for those really extreme scenarios. And some people are arguing for that safety valve reason, we need to at least do more research on it. Some people are arguing that we'll start making it attractive to people that want to use it before it's needed to be used as a safety valve. So how do you deal with that ethically?
I see the dilemma.
So the final thing I will say about it is that the real problem there is governance. So who gets to decide?
You have to catch a train,
yes.
so make it...
Well, it's interesting for this question. So the COP is not yet discussing it. And I think it would be very difficult to figure a global decision-making system that would decide when to deploy it and when also to possibly stop it again. So that would be the litmus test to me. If we have a governance mechanism for it, then we could start considering deploying it.
Okay. Maarten, I think this was a very fascinating evening. There are many more questions, but unfortunately you have to go back to the West. I want a very, very big hand for you. It was very insightful.
And for all of you.
Behind the screen.